Dawn broke over the Sea of Marmara, and the light reached the city slowly. The water was calm, the walls were still. From a distance, Constantinople looked unchanged, as it had for centuries. Stone towers rose above the shoreline, church domes caught the early sun. The city appeared whole. Up close, the signs were harder to ignore. Entire neighborhoods stood empty. Gardens had replaced streets. Where crowds once gathered, goats wandered between broken columns. The city had shrunk inward over generations, retreating from its own scale. What remained was dense with memory and uneven with loss. Constantinople had been built for an empire that no longer existed. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire held little beyond the city itself. Its lands were scattered. Its income was thin. Its population was a fraction of what it had once been. Yet the capital endured. People still repaired roofs. Priests still held services. Markets still opened in the morning, even when little was sold. The walls defined life here. They had done so for over 1,000 years. 3 lines of stone and earth stretched across the landward side of the city, scarred by earthquakes and earlier sieges, repaired again and again with whatever materials could be found. Each generation added its own work, layering survival onto survival. Inside those walls lived perhaps 50,000 people. Some were Greeks whose families had never left. Others were Genoese, Venetians, Armenians, and refugees from towns already lost. They lived close together, sharing wells and streets, aware that the walls were the only reason they were still here. The city's churches carried the weight of that awareness. Their interiors were dim, heavy with incense and worn stone. Icons darkened by age watched over congregations that had grown smaller each year. Services continued as they always had, though the empire they once served no longer protected the faithful who gathered there. Outside the city, the world had changed. Ottoman territory pressed in from every direction. Villages that once answered to Constantinople now paid taxes elsewhere. Roads that once led safely into the city ended in foreign hands. The capital had become an island surrounded by land. Ships could still reach the harbor, but fewer came each year. Trade routes shifted. Goods grew expensive. Food depended on careful rationing and outside help that arrived irregularly. The city survived through planning and restraint, rather than abundance. The population adapted. People learned which neighborhoods were safest. They learned which gates opened and closed at which hours. They listened for news carried by sailors and messengers, knowing that bad news traveled faster than good. The memory of earlier sieges lingered. Constantinople had faced Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and rivals who claimed to rule in its name. The walls had failed once before, in 1204 when Latin Crusaders broke through and looted the city. That wound had never fully healed. Churches still bore scars. Families still remembered where sacred objects had been taken or destroyed. That history shaped expectations in 1453. People understood that survival was not guaranteed by tradition. The city had been taken before. It could be taken again. The difference now was scale. In earlier centuries, Constantinople could call on armies from across an empire. Fleets could be raised. Allies could be pressured or paid. By the mid-15th century, those options were gone. The city relied on its own defenders and a small number of foreign volunteers who chose to stay. Most of the defense came from citizens. Artisans carried weapons at night and returned to their trades during the day. Fishermen repaired sections of wall alongside soldiers. Older men supervised work crews, passing down instructions learned decades earlier. The walls remained formidable, but they were no longer enough by themselves. Gunpowder weapons had changed the balance of power. The city possessed some artillery, but it was limited in number and unreliable. Repairs mattered more than counterfire. Every evening, teams moved along the walls with stone, timber, and earth. Breaches from earlier bombardments were filled as best they could. By morning, the defenders would return to their positions, knowing the work would need to be done again. Inside the city, life continued with care. Bells rang at fixed hours. Children learned to stay close to home. Merchants adjusted prices daily. Rumors spread and faded. People learned to distinguish between stories meant to frighten and those that carried weight. The imperial palace still stood, though much of it was unused. Rooms once meant for ceremonies remained dark. The emperor governed from necessity rather than display. His authority rested on presence and effort, not splendor. Constantinople no longer impressed by scale. It endured through habit and attention. The city's defenders understood what they were holding. They did not speak often of victory. They spoke of time. Each day the walls stood bought another day of life inside them. Each repair delayed a decision that would come eventually. From the towers, guards looked out over fields where tents would soon appear. They watched the roads. They counted ships on the horizon. They prepared for a siege that many believed was unavoidable. Constantinople had refused to disappear when its empire vanished. It adapted to weakness. It accepted loss. It held on to routines that made survival possible. By the spring of 1453, that long practice of endurance was about to be tested one final time. The city did not stand because it was strong. It stood because it had learned how to remain standing when strength was no longer available. Morning settled over the city without ceremony. Bells rang as they always had. Ships moved slowly in the harbor. Along the walls, guards changed shifts and checked equipment that had already been checked the night before. Constantine XI ruled from inside this routine. Beyond the walls of Constantinople, there was little left of the empire he governed. Most territories were gone. Towns that once sent taxes and soldiers now answered to other rulers. Messages from abroad arrived late, if they arrived at all. The title of emperor still carried history, but it no longer commanded resources. Constantine understood this clearly. He had taken the throne in 1449 after years of service in frontier regions. He had governed exposed provinces, dealt with rival powers, and watched imperial authority weaken year by year. When he returned to Constantinople as emperor, he did not expect rescue from old alliances or distant promises. His days were spent preparing the city for siege. He walked the walls with engineers and commanders, stopping to ask practical questions. How much stone remained? Which towers needed repair first? How many men could hold a section through the night? Decisions were recorded and acted on quickly. There was little ceremony left to maintain. Constantine stayed close to the defenses. He slept little. Meals were brief. Messages were answered in person whenever possible. Authority worked best when it was visible and consistent. The force available to him was small. The defenders numbered only a few thousand. Some were citizens. Others were foreign volunteers who had chosen to remain, including experienced soldiers from Italy who understood siege warfare. Constantine treated them as partners rather than symbols. He needed their skill. Every able person in the city was assigned a task. Soldiers guarded gates and towers. Artisans repaired damage after each bombardment. Sailors crewed the remaining ships. Older men supervised stores and rationing. Women carried water, stone, and timber to crews working through the night. Negotiations continued even as preparations intensified. Envoys arrived from the Ottoman camp offering terms. Surrender would spare the city. Exile would preserve Constantine's life and allow him to rule elsewhere under protection. The offers were formal and deliberate. Constantine refused them. The refusal followed custom rather than impulse. An emperor could not surrender the imperial capital without attempting its defense. The city expected resistance. The defenders required clarity. Uncertainty would weaken discipline at the walls. Religion complicated the situation inside the city. In an effort to secure support from the West, Constantine had accepted the union of the Eastern and Western churches. The agreement existed on paper, but it divided the population. Some clergy accepted it, others rejected it openly. Arguments surfaced in churches and public spaces. Constantine did not force the issue. Internal conflict would damage the defense more than any disagreement could help it. He focused instead on coordination. Defense plans were finalized. Weak sections of wall were reinforced. Each gate was placed under a commander who reported directly to the emperor. Signals were standardized so warnings could move quickly during an attack. Contingencies were discussed plainly. Constantine made no promises of victory. He promised effort and order. As the Ottoman army gathered outside the city in early April 1453, Constantine continued to move through Constantinople on foot. He spoke briefly with defenders at their posts. He visited churches without ceremony. He avoided large assemblies that could turn unstable. Those who encountered him described a man under strain, but controlled. He did not exaggerate danger. He did not minimize it. He expected discipline because the situation demanded it. When the siege began, Constantine took up his place along the land walls. He coordinated with his commanders and responded to breaches as they appeared. He remained visible during bombardments, even when the ground shook beneath the towers. At night, repair crews worked under torchlight. Constantine often returned to the walls to observe progress. Orders were adjusted as damage accumulated. No position remained secure for long. Inside the city, daily life narrowed around these preparations. People learned where the emperor was likely to be and adjusted their movements accordingly. His presence mattered. It signaled that the defense remained organized. Constantine understood what survival required. It required structure more than optimism. It required preparation more than speeches. The city did not need reassurance. It needed coordination. As days passed, supplies diminished and fatigue spread. Reports of damage arrived faster than repairs could keep pace. Still, Constantine did not reopen negotiations. By remaining in the city, he had already accepted the likely outcome. Leaving would have preserved his life and ended resistance. Staying meant the city would fight as long as it could. This decision shaped everything that followed. When the final assault came, Constantine would be where he had been throughout the siege, near the front, directing defense, sharing the same risks as those around him. His role was not symbolic. It was practical. In a city that had lost almost everything else, the presence of an emperor who stayed and prepared mattered. It did not change the balance of forces. It did not alter the outcome. Across the water from Constantinople, the land was already crowded with tents. At dawn, smoke rose from hundreds of small fires as soldiers prepared their meals. Horses were fed and checked. Weapons were laid out and cleaned. The Ottoman camp followed a routine built through years of campaigning, steady and practiced. At its center was Mehmed. He was 21 years old. Mehmed had become Sultan 2 years earlier, inheriting a state that was strong, wealthy and confident. The Ottomans controlled most of Anatolia and the Balkans. Their armies were large, disciplined and accustomed to siege warfare. Their administration functioned. Taxes were collected. Supplies moved when ordered. Constantinople sat in the middle of this expanding power like an unfinished task. Mehmed had grown up with the city as an expectation rather than a dream. From childhood he had been taught its importance. It was the old imperial capital. It controlled the straits. It stood as a symbol that rival powers still looked to with respect. As long as it remained unconquered, the Ottoman state felt incomplete. Earlier sultans had tried and failed to take it. Mehmed did not intend to repeat their mistakes. He prepared carefully. Months before the army moved, he ordered the construction of a massive fortress on the Bosphorus, positioned to control traffic into the city. Its walls rose quickly. Its guns faced the water. Ships that refused inspection were stopped or destroyed. The message was direct. He gathered resources without hurry. Cannon founders were recruited and paid well. Large artillery pieces were cast and tested. Roads were improved to move heavy equipment. Supplies were stockpiled. The campaign was planned as a certainty, not a gamble. Mehmed did not rely on enthusiasm alone. He relied on structure. His army reflected that approach. Janissaries formed the core, trained from youth and loyal to the state rather than any tribe. Around them gathered soldiers from across the empire, supported by engineers, laborers, and administrators. This was not a raid, it was a coordinated operation. Mehmed listened to advice, but he made decisions himself. Some councillors urged caution. The city's walls were famous. A failed siege would damage prestige. Mehmed accepted the risk. Delay carried its own cost. Each year Constantinople remained independent, allowed rivals to imagine limits to Ottoman power. He resolved to act. As the army assembled, Mehmed maintained discipline. Orders were enforced. Punishments were clear. Rewards were promised, but only after success. Loot was expected, but control would follow conquest. The army understood what was at stake. When negotiations were attempted, Mehmed allowed them. Envoys were sent to the city offering terms. Surrender would preserve lives. The population would be spared unnecessary violence. Constantine would be granted territory elsewhere. These offers were formal and measured. Mehmed did not expect acceptance, but the attempt served its purpose. Once refusal came, preparation turned fully toward attack. The Ottoman fleet moved into position. Ships blocked exits. Engineers surveyed the walls. Artillery was brought forward piece by piece. Each placement was deliberate. Each gun had an assigned role. Mehmed observed closely. He spent long hours near the lines, listening to reports and adjusting plans. He did not fight personally, but his presence shaped the pace of operations. Orders moved quickly. Failures were corrected. The bombardment began slowly. Early shots tested range and effect. Damage was measured. Crews learned how the walls responded. When sections weakened, pressure increased. The goal was not speed, it was inevitability. Inside the city, the sound of cannon carried across the walls. Outside, Mehmed watched for response. Repairs at night confirmed that the defenders were organized and committed. The siege would not be brief. Mehmed adjusted accordingly. Supplies continued to arrive. Troops rotated. The camp remained orderly. The siege settled into rhythm, controlled and sustained. For Mehmed, Constantinople represented more than territory. It was the final barrier between the Ottoman state and unquestioned regional dominance. Taking it would secure trade routes, unify lands, and establish his authority beyond doubt. Failure was not acceptable. As days passed, Mehmed's resolve did not soften. Each repair made by the defenders confirmed the need for continued pressure. Each delay reinforced the importance of complete preparation. The young sultan did not rush the city. He intended to wear it down. By the time the siege entered its later stages, the balance was clear. One side relied on endurance and repair, the other relied on resources and patience. Mehmed had arranged matters so patience favored him. From his position outside the walls, he He watched the city hold together through effort rather than strength. He respected that resistance. He also understood its limits. The outcome would be decided by persistence. And he had planned for that from the beginning. The walls of Constantinople stretched across the land like a boundary drawn by habit and repair. From the Sea of Marmara in the south to the Golden Horn in the north, they formed the last fixed line between the city and everything beyond it. At first light, men took their places along the ramparts. Some had slept in shifts beside their posts. Others arrived carrying tools instead of weapons. Stone dust still clung to their hands from the night's work. These walls had been standing for centuries. They were not a single barrier, but a system. A wide ditch lay in front, often dry now, followed by an outer wall, then a broad terrace, and finally the main wall itself. Towers rose at intervals, some intact, others scarred and reinforced with timber. Each section bore the marks of earlier sieges and later repairs. The defenders knew every weakness. Earthquakes had cracked foundations. Rainwater had weakened mortar. Earlier bombardments had left patched sections that never fully hardened. The walls looked imposing from a distance, but those tasked with holding them understood where pressure would fall. Responsibility was divided carefully. Each gate and tower had a commander. Men were assigned fixed positions and expected to remain there unless ordered otherwise. Signals were agreed upon in advance. Bells, flags, and shouted commands carried warnings along the line. Artillery crews manned the city's guns. These were few and inconsistent, more useful for harassment than defense. Powder was rationed. Shots were chosen carefully. The real work came after sunset. When the Ottoman bombardment paused, repair teams moved forward. They worked under torchlight, hauling stone, timber, and earth to damaged sections. Loose blocks were reset, gaps were filled with whatever material could be found. Nothing was wasted. Broken columns from abandoned buildings were dragged to the walls and cut down for use. Men worked quickly, knowing they would be targeted again at dawn. The sound of hammering and shouted instructions carried across the terraces. Guards watched the darkness beyond the ditch, listening for movement. Sleep came in short intervals, taken where possible. From the Ottoman lines, the walls remained the central problem. Cannon fire struck them day after day. Some shots chipped stone, others cracked towers. A few opened holes wide enough for concern. Each impact was measured by both sides. When damage accumulated faster than it could be repaired, commanders shifted men to reinforce those areas. The Gate of St. Romanus drew particular attention. This section of the wall stood on lower ground. The terrain favored artillery placement. Ottoman guns focused their fire here repeatedly, returning to the same points even after repairs were made. The defenders responded by layering earth behind the stone, absorbing shock and slowing collapse. The pattern repeated. Daylight brought bombardment, night brought repair. Fatigue became a constant factor. Men learned to work through it. Mistakes were corrected quickly when possible. Discipline mattered more than speed. The walls shaped behavior inside the city. Civilians avoided the landward districts closest to the fighting. Homes near the walls were emptied. Supplies were moved inward. Streets that once carried trade now carried stretchers and carts of rubble. Children were kept away from windows. Fires were covered at night. The city adapted its habits to the rhythm imposed by the siege. Commanders walked the line frequently. Constantine was often seen with them, inspecting damage and listening to reports. His presence did not stop the bombardment, but it reinforced order. The defenders understood that decisions were being made with awareness of conditions. Foreign volunteers held key positions. Experienced soldiers were placed where pressure was greatest. They coordinated with citizen defenders who lacked formal training, but understood the terrain. Trust was built through shared labor rather than speeches. The walls demanded cooperation. No single group could hold them alone. Every section depended on the next. A failure in one place threatened all others. The Ottomans tested this. Small probing attacks followed heavy bombardments. Ladders were brought forward. Infantry advanced to see how quickly defenders responded. These actions rarely succeeded, but they provided information. The defenders responded cautiously. They avoided unnecessary pursuit. They conserved strength. Orders emphasized holding position rather than counterattack. The walls existed to absorb pressure, not to invite risk. As weeks passed, damage accumulated despite constant repair. Stone weakened, timber splintered, earthworks slumped under repeated impact. Each morning revealed new problems. Each evening brought another round of improvisation. The walls still stood, but they were changing. Their profile softened as earth filled gaps once edged with stone. Towers lost height. Some walkways narrowed. The structure remained continuous, but its original form faded under strain. This mattered. The walls had always been more than physical barriers. They organized defense. They created predictability. As they degraded, that predictability weakened. Defenders began to rely more on timing than structure. They learned when bombardment was likely to pause. They anticipated shifts in fire. They prepared reserves in advance. Experience replaced certainty. The Ottoman army adapted as well. Guns were repositioned. New batteries were brought forward. Pressure increased at selected points rather than across the entire line. The goal narrowed from general damage to specific collapse. By late May, the balance had shifted. The walls still blocked entry, but only through constant effort. A single failed repair could open a breach that could not be closed in time. The margin for error had disappeared. Those holding the line understood this. They did not speak often about the future. Conversations stayed focused on tasks. Who would cover which section? Where materials were stored? How many men remained fit for duty? The walls continued to function because people continued to work. They held because effort replaced strength. When the final assault came, it would not be because the walls had suddenly failed. It would come because they had been worn down piece by piece, hour by hour. For centuries, Constantinople had trusted its walls to buy time. In 1453, time was the only resource they had left. Dawn revealed the damage left from the night before. Stone lay scattered at the base of the wall. Fresh cracks ran through sections that had held for centuries. Dust still hung in the air, settling slowly as repair crews gathered their tools. The Ottoman guns had fired again through the night. They did not fire constantly. Crews worked in measured intervals, adjusting their aim and spacing their shots. Each round was observed, each result was noted. The bombardment was deliberate, shaped by patience rather than urgency. Inside Constantinople, the sound of cannon fire no longer caused surprise. People paused when it came, then continued with what they were doing. The noise had become part of the city's rhythm, a marker that divided the day into before and after. Along the land walls, defenders moved forward as soon as firing stopped. Broken stone was cleared away first. Then earth was packed into gaps behind the outer face of the wall. Timber was driven into place to support weakened sections. Repairs began without discussion. Everyone knew the order of work. The walls did not collapse under the first impacts. They absorbed the blows unevenly. Some areas resisted better than expected. Others weakened faster. Cracks widened gradually. Towers lost shape. Walkways narrowed as debris accumulated. Each day altered the structure slightly. From the Ottoman lines, The change was visible. Guns were shifted closer when terrain allowed. Larger pieces were brought forward where damage proved insufficient. Smaller guns continued to harass defenders, forcing them to remain under cover and limiting movement along the parapets. The artillery did not exist to breach the city in a single strike. It existed to remove certainty. Inside the city, that effect was felt quickly. Repair crews worked longer hours. Materials became harder to find. Stone was taken from abandoned buildings deeper inside Constantinople and dragged outward. Columns and walls that had once supported homes were broken down to support the defenses. The city began to dismantle itself to remain standing. Civilians adapted to the schedule imposed by the guns. Markets opened later. Streets near the walls emptied during bombardment. Fires were kept low. Children were moved away from areas where falling debris was common. The sound of impact carried through the ground. People learned to recognize which shots mattered. A deep strike meant heavy damage somewhere along the line. Lighter impacts were noted, then ignored. Fatigue became the greater threat. Men who repaired the walls at night tried to sleep during the morning hours. Others rotated into position as guards. Rest was taken wherever it could be found, often in short intervals. Commanders tracked these limits closely. Sections that received sustained fire were reinforced with additional men. Reserves were held back to respond to sudden breaches. Orders emphasized caution. Counterattacks were discouraged. The walls existed to be held, not to invite pursuit. The gate of St. Romanus drew repeated attention. Its position on lower ground made it vulnerable to concentrated fire. Ottoman guns returned to it again and again. Each night, defenders layered earth behind the damaged stone, thickening the wall while changing its shape. By mid-May, the wall in this area no longer resembled its original form. It stood through effort rather than design. Inside the Ottoman camp, the bombardment was treated as one part of a longer process. Infantry probes followed heavy firing. These attacks were limited and cautious, meant to test response times and coordination. Defenders repelled them without chasing retreating troops. Both sides adjusted. The cannons shortened the future without announcing it. Each repair restored only part of what had been lost. Each new impact added stress to an already weakened structure. The balance shifted slowly, measured in days rather than moments. Inside the city, conversation changed. People spoke less about holding indefinitely. They spoke about holding through the next night, through the next round of firing. The walls still stood, but the margin for error narrowed with every sunrise. A single missed repair could now open a gap too wide to close in time. A single exhausted crew could leave a section vulnerable for hours. The cannons had altered the meaning of defense. Previously, the walls bought years. Now, they bought days, sometimes only hours. Still, the work continued. Men lifted stone and packed earth as the guns resumed. Guards returned to their posts. Orders were followed because stopping would guarantee failure. The artillery did not decide the siege on its own. It prepared the conditions under which a final decision would be forced. By the time the last assault approached, the walls remained standing largely because people refused to abandon them. They held through repetition, exhaustion, and adjustment. The cannons did not end the city. They reduced the time it had left. Dawn came quietly inside the city. There were no horns, no announcements. Light spread through narrow streets and empty courtyards. Smoke from cooking fires drifted low and thin, careful not to rise above the rooftops. People woke where they had slept, often fully dressed, and listened before they moved. The guns were silent for the moment. That silence did not bring relief. It brought attention. People counted how long it lasted and prepared for its end. Church doors opened early. Men and women entered without speaking. Some carried candles. Others brought small bundles of food or clothing to leave behind. The interiors were dim, lit unevenly by oil lamps and morning light filtering through high windows. Icons looked down from darkened walls, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of touch. Services were shorter now. Priests read scripture in steady voices. There were prayers for endurance, for protection, for forgiveness. There were no promises made about outcomes. When the distant sound of artillery reached the church, no one turned toward the doors. The reading continued. Faith had become part of the city's routine. It structured the hours. It marked the days. It gave people a place to go when waiting felt unmanageable. It did not remove uncertainty. It helped contain it. Outside the churches, daily life contracted further. Food was distributed in smaller portions. Supplies were recorded carefully. Families cooked what they could with what remained. Meals were eaten quickly and shared evenly. Waste was avoided without discussion. Markets still opened, but many stalls were empty. Trade had slowed to a trickle. Prices shifted from day to day. People learned which items mattered and which could be set aside. Luxury disappeared first. Convenience followed. Children stayed close to home. They learned to recognize the sound of different guns. They learned which streets were safest during bombardment and which to avoid. Games became quieter and more contained. Parents watched more closely. The walls shaped everything. Repairs continued through the night. When firing paused, crews moved forward with stone, timber, and earth. Work lights glowed briefly along the ramparts and were then extinguished. By morning, the evidence of damage was partly concealed, never fully erased. Those who repaired the walls returned to the city before daylight. They slept when they could, often on floors or benches. Others took their place on watch. The rotation was imperfect. Fatigue accumulated unevenly. Fear expressed itself in small ways. People packed belongings and kept them close. Valuables were moved into churches or cellars. Some families chose a single room and stayed there. Others shifted locations repeatedly, looking for safety in movement. Rumors moved through the city. Some spoke of ships gathering in the west. Others claimed divisions in the Ottoman camp. These stories spread quickly and faded just as fast. People listened, but they no longer reorganized their lives around such reports. Waiting demanded restraint. Arguments did occur, but rarely over belief or politics. Disputes were practical. Access to water, distribution of food, space in shelters. The pressure of the siege narrowed priorities. Religious divisions remained present, but subdued. The agreement to unite the Eastern and Western churches had never fully taken hold. Some clergy supported it, others rejected it openly. During the siege, these differences mattered less than shared survival. Processions still took place. Clergy walked through certain districts carrying icons and relics. People followed at a distance. The pace was measured. These acts were familiar, repeated from earlier crises. They offered structure rather than assurance. Constantine did not attend every service. When he did appear, it was without ceremony. He stood among others, listened, and left quietly. His attention remained focused on the walls and the coordination of defense. Inside the palace, activity continued steadily. Messages arrived and were answered. Reports from commanders were reviewed. Orders were issued with care. There were no public addresses. The emperor did not attempt to raise spirits through words. Continuity mattered more than inspiration. The city learned to live inside narrowing limits. Water was rationed, wells were monitored, fires were kept small, movement was timed to avoid bombardment hours. These adjustments became habit. The sound of artillery divided the day. People learned when to expect it. When firing resumed, conversation paused. When it stopped, tasks continued. Life reorganized itself around interruption. Loss was registered quietly. People noticed when neighbors failed to return. They adjusted without comment. Grief was private. Public displays risked disorder. As May progressed, strain became visible. Repairs required material taken from deeper within the city. Abandoned buildings were dismantled. Public spaces emptied. Entire streets fell silent. People prepared without naming what they prepared for. Some wrote letters. Others made small arrangements within families. A few sought confession more frequently. Many did nothing outwardly at all. Waiting filled the space between action and consequence. It was not passive. It required attention, discipline, and restraint. It demanded that people continue routines even when those routines felt fragile. By the final days before the assault, waiting became the city's dominant condition. People waited for news from the walls. They waited for the next bombardment. They waited for orders they suspected might not come in time. Still, the city functioned. Churches opened and closed on schedule. Repair crews reported for duty. Guards took their posts. The systems that remained continued because abandoning them would remove the last sense of control. Faith provided structure. Fear sharpened awareness. Waiting held everything together. When the final moment arrived, it would come without warning. Until then, Constantinople endured by doing what it had learned to do best. It waited. Before first light on May 29, 1453, the air outside Constantinople was already heavy with sound. Drums rolled from the Ottoman camp. Horns answered. Orders moved through the darkness in short commands passed from one unit to the next. Inside the city, the defenders were awake. Most had not slept. They stood at their assigned sections of wall, weapons ready, eyes fixed on the ground beyond the ditch. Repairs from the night before were unfinished. Earth was still loose in places. Timber supports creaked under their own weight. The assault began before sunrise. Mehmed ordered his forces forward in waves. The first attackers were irregular troops, sent to exhaust the defenders and draw fire. They moved quickly across the ground, carrying ladders and shields, shouting as they advanced. Many were cut down before reaching the walls. Others reached the ditch and fell there. The defenders held their positions. They pushed ladders away. They fired from behind damaged parapets. Stones and arrows fell onto the attackers below. Orders were shouted along the wall as sections came under pressure. When the first wave withdrew, the second followed. These troops were better equipped and more disciplined. They advanced with less noise, covering ground methodically. They attacked weakened sections identified during the bombardment, concentrating near the gate of St. Romanus, where the wall had absorbed weeks of sustained fire. Here, the structure was already compromised. The outer wall had been battered down. The inner wall stood behind earthworks that had replaced much of the original stone. Defenders fought from positions that shifted with every impact. The fighting intensified. The defenders repelled several assaults, but the effort required constant movement. Men were pulled from quieter sections to reinforce areas under attack. Reserves dwindled. As the light increased, the third wave prepared. This time, the Janissaries moved forward. They advanced in formation, disciplined and silent. Their officers directed movement carefully, pushing toward the same weakened points again and again. The assault did not rely on speed, it relied on prolonged pressure. At the gate of St. Romanus, the defense began to fail. A large section of earthwork collapsed under combined fire and assault. Defenders rushed to fill the gap, but the opening widened faster than it could be closed. Fighting moved into the breach itself. At this moment, confusion spread. Orders overlapped. Signals were missed. Smoke and dust reduced visibility. Some defenders continued to fight at the wall, unaware that the line had been broken nearby. Giustiniani, commanding the defense in this sector, was wounded. He was carried from the wall, bleeding heavily. His removal disrupted coordination at the most critical point. Men who had relied on his direction hesitated, unsure who now held command. The breach widened. Ottoman troops poured through, pushing into the space behind the wall. Defenders fell back towards secondary positions, trying to reorganize under pressure. Further north, At the Kirche Porta, a smaller gate was found open. Whether it had been left unsecured during night repairs or open during the confusion remains unclear. Ottoman soldiers entered through it, spreading into the city. Resistance continued, but it lost coherence. Constantine was near the fighting when the breach occurred. He had moved between sections throughout the assault, directing reinforcements and urging defenders to hold. As the situation deteriorated, he remained close to the front, refusing to withdraw. With the walls breached and Ottoman troops entering the city, the nature of the fighting changed. Defenders fought in small groups, command broke down, streets near the walls filled with wounded men and civilians trying to escape the area. The emperor was last seen near the gate of St. Romanus. Witnesses later reported that he removed his imperial insignia and joined the fighting as a soldier. What followed was chaos. His body was never publicly identified. By mid-morning, organized resistance had ended. Ottoman forces controlled the walls and moved deeper into the city. Defenders who remained alive withdrew or were cut down where they stood. The assault had not been decided by a single moment. It was decided by accumulation. Weeks of bombardment, nights of repair, hours of sustained assault, and a single failure at a critical point combined to break the defense. The city had held as long as it could. When the walls finally failed, they did so under the weight of exhaustion rather than sudden collapse. As the sun rose fully over Constantinople, the Roman Empire ended not in ceremony, but in confusion, smoke, and close combat. The city had resisted through planning, labor, and discipline. In the end, it was overcome by forces that could replace losses faster than the defenders could replace men. What followed would reshape the city forever. But the decision was made here, before dawn, at the walls. This was the final assault. Morning light reached the streets near the land walls unevenly. Smoke drifted through alleys where fighting had already passed. The sound of combat moved away from the breach in bursts, then returned without warning. The wall had been broken. What remained of the defense dissolved into small actions. Groups of soldiers gathered where they could. Orders no longer traveled far. Men fought beside whoever stood nearest, using familiar ground to delay an enemy that now moved freely. Constantine XI was among them. He had remained near the gate of St. Romanus as the breach widened. Witnesses later placed him moving between defenders, urging them to hold positions that no longer connected to a line. He fought as conditions allowed, directing what resistance could still be organized. Imperial command ended here. There was no council, no formal order. The loss of the wall removed the structure that made command possible. Messages could not move. Signals went unanswered. The fight became local. As Ottoman troops pushed deeper into the area behind the breach, Constantine stayed. Accounts differ on what followed. Some describe him removing his imperial insignia before entering the fighting. Others recall him wearing his armor and helmet without distinction. What is consistent is his refusal to withdraw. He fought where the pressure was greatest. The area around the breach filled with smoke and debris. Visibility dropped. Shouting replaced signals. Men stumbled over fallen masonry and bodies as they tried to regroup. Constantine was last seen alive near the inner defenses. He stood with a small group of soldiers as Ottoman troops pressed forward. Those who survived could not later say how long the fight continued. There was no confirmed identification of his body. After the fighting ended, Ottoman forces searched among the dead. Some accounts suggest a body believed to be the emperor was found by the presence of imperial footwear. Others treat this as uncertain. No public display followed. No burial site was recorded with certainty. This uncertainty shaped how the moment was remembered. Constantine's death did not resemble earlier imperial endings. There was no surrender ceremony, no negotiated exile, no formal execution. The last emperor disappeared into the collapse of the defense. For those inside the city, the change was immediate. Without imperial command, resistance fractured further. Some defenders continued fighting in isolated pockets, others retreated into the city, seeking safety for civilians or attempting escape. The palace fell silent. Officials who had remained at their posts abandoned them. Records were left unfinished. Rooms emptied quickly. The structure of government ceased to function without announcement. Civilians near the walls fled deeper into the city. They moved through streets already altered by weeks of siege. Buildings stood open. Belongings lay where they had been dropped. Fires smoldered unattended. The fall of the emperor did not bring immediate calm. Fighting continued in places for hours. Some defenders held positions long after the outcome was clear. Others were cut down where they stood. The city had no center now. Constantine's role had been practical rather than symbolic throughout the siege. When that role ended, nothing remained to replace it. Authority had been tied to presence and coordination. Both vanished with him. Later chroniclers struggled with this moment. Some framed Constantine's death as heroic. Others described it as inevitable. Contemporary accounts offered fewer certainties. They recorded confusion, smoke, and loss of control. This uncertainty mattered. It reflected how the empire ended in practice. The final command did not fail through betrayal or dramatic choice. It failed when conditions made command impossible. By late morning, Ottoman forces controlled the walls and key routes into the city. Imperial resistance no longer operated as a whole. The empire existed only in memory and scattered effort. Constantine XI left no successor able to command. His death closed a line that had ruled in Constantinople for more than 1,000 years. It did so without witnesses who could agree on the details. The emperor fell where coordination ended and survival took its place. What followed would determine the fate of the city. The empire's fate had already been decided. Morning moved slowly through Constantinople. The fighting near the walls had thinned, but it had not fully stopped. Smoke rose from scattered fires. Shouts echoed through streets that had already emptied. The sound of boots and metal replaced the rhythms the city had known for generations. Ottoman soldiers entered in groups. Some came through the breaches near the land walls. Others moved through gates that no longer had defenders. They advanced cautiously at first, expecting resistance that no longer existed in organized form. What they found was a city without command. Defenders who still lived fought in small pockets or withdrew toward neighborhoods farther from the walls. Civilians ran or hid. Doors were barred from the inside. Churches filled quickly. The sack began unevenly. Some units followed orders and moved forward without stopping. Others broke formation and began taking what they could. Shops were forced open. Homes were entered. People were pulled into the streets or driven inside at sword point. Loot was taken quickly. Clothing, food, tools, religious objects, and anything portable changed hands. Items without value were left behind or destroyed. The process followed no pattern beyond opportunity. Captives were taken alongside goods. Men, women, and children were bound and gathered in groups. Some resisted and were killed where they stood. Others were dragged away. Families were separated without ceremony. The violence varied by district. Areas closer to the walls suffered first. Resistance there had lasted longest, and retaliation followed. Farther inside the city, the pace was slower. News of what was happening arrived ahead of the soldiers, sending people into flight or concealment. Churches became places of refuge. People crowded inside, hoping for protection through proximity and custom. Some clergy attempted to negotiate. Others locked doors and waited. The Hagia Sophia filled quickly. Its doors were closed from the inside as long as possible. When they were forced open, those inside were taken captive. Sacred objects were removed. The building was secured. By midday, the disorder had spread. Ottoman officers attempted to reassert control, but discipline took time to restore. The scale of the city and the number of troops involved made coordination difficult. Mehmed entered Constantinople later that day. He rode through sections of the city that had already been damaged by siege and assault. Bodies lay uncollected, fires smoldered, looted buildings stood open. He ordered the violence to be restrained. Orders went out to stop uncontrolled looting and killing. Soldiers were told to regroup. Areas of importance were secured. Guards were posted. This did not end the suffering. What had begun could not be reversed. Captives were already taken. Homes were already emptied. Loss could not be undone. The city passed formally into Ottoman control. Mehmed claimed Constantinople as his capital. Administrative structures began to take shape almost immediately. Officials were appointed. Orders were issued to restore basic order. Survivors emerged cautiously. Those who had hidden listened for signs that the violence had ended. Some found their homes intact. Others returned to nothing. The city's population had changed in a single day. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. Skilled workers were identified and spared for future use. Others were dispersed. Constantinople did not burn to the ground. It was taken, stripped, and reorganized. The sack followed patterns familiar from earlier wars, but its scale was shaped by the city's long resistance and sudden collapse. Control returned gradually, enforced by authority rather than exhaustion. As night fell, the sounds of violence diminished. Fires were put out, patrols moved through the streets, prisoners were held under guard. The city entered a new phase of silence. What had been lost could not be counted yet. Records were gone, families were broken, institutions had collapsed. The Roman capital had ceased to exist. In its place stood a conquered city, alive but transformed. The struggle for Constantinople was over. The struggle to live inside what followed had just begun. The day after the city was taken did not feel like an ending. The sun rose, as it always had, over the Bosphorus. Water moved through the harbour. Smoke drifted from scattered fires left from the fighting. Life did not stop. It changed direction. Ottoman patrols moved through Constantinople with purpose. Orders were given, streets were cleared, key buildings were secured. What remained of resistance disappeared quietly, not through battle, but through absence. The city adjusted. Those who survived learned quickly which rules now applied. Movement required permission. Curfews were enforced. Certain districts were restricted. Others reopened slowly, under supervision. Mehmed established himself in the city within days. He claimed Constantinople as his capital, not as a ruin, but as a working city. Repairs were ordered. Administration resumed, and clergy who cooperated were allowed to continue their duties under new terms. The transition was firm and deliberate. Violence receded, replaced by structure. The sack ended. Control took its place. For those who had lived under the empire, the change was immediate. Titles meant nothing. Offices no longer existed. Documents that once carried authority were ignored. People who had served the imperial system found themselves without a role. Some left. Scholars, officials, and merchants gathered what they could carry and moved west. They traveled by ship or along uncertain roads, bringing with them books, training, and habits formed over centuries. These men did not see themselves as refugees at first. They believed the loss might be temporary. They spoke of return. They wrote letters describing conditions inside the city. Over time, those letters stopped. What they carried mattered. Manuscripts written and copied in Constantinople found new homes in Italian cities. Knowledge that had been preserved through war and decline entered new hands. The process was gradual, not sudden, but its effect lasted. Trade shifted as well. Routes that once passed through Byzantine territory now required Ottoman approval. Merchants adjusted. Prices changed. New centers gained influence as old ones declined. No announcement marked this shift. It happened through contracts, taxes, and decisions made far from the fallen walls. For the Ottoman state, the capture of Constantinople confirmed its position. The city connected its European and Asian lands. It controlled key waterways. It provided prestige that no earlier capital could match. The transformation was practical. Mosques replaced churches in prominent locations. Administrative buildings were repurposed. Neighborhoods were reorganized. New populations were brought in to restore activity. Constantinople did not disappear. It became something else. For those who remained, daily life resumed under new limits. Markets reopened. Crafts continued. Families adapted to regulations that were unfamiliar but enforceable. The empire that had once defined the city was no longer part of that life. The Roman imperial line ended without ceremony. There was no successor, no court in exile that carried authority. The title vanished from use. What remained was memory. This absence mattered more than destruction would have. Empires often leave ruins. This one left records, habits, and arguments that no longer had a place. The fall of Constantinople did not end history. It altered its direction. States adjusted their strategies. Powers recalculated their borders. Rulers elsewhere understood that fortifications once thought permanent could fail under sustained pressure. The change spread outward slowly. News traveled by ship and messenger. Reactions varied by distance and interest. Some mourned, others measured opportunity. The world absorbed the event without pause. Within the city, seasons passed. Walls were repaired where they still mattered. Streets filled again. New generations grew up knowing Constantinople only as an Ottoman city. The memory of the empire persisted in writing, in liturgy, and in private accounts. It no longer shaped policy. The fall of Constantinople closed one long chapter of rule built on continuity and inherited authority. It replaced it with governance rooted in control, resources, and expansion. No single moment captured this shift. It unfolded through administration, movement, and time. The city endured because cities often do. The empire did not. That distinction defines the legacy of 1453. What ended was not stone or population, but a system that had carried the idea of Roman rule across centuries. When Constantinople fell, the world did not collapse. It simply moved on.